everything we want to prevent in
Yeah.
the lives of kids are the consequence of stigma, discrimination, and mistreatment in childhood, in adolescence.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. For the second episode of Pride Month, I asked Stephen Russell to describe what we know from research about supporting kids as they realize their orientations and identities. Stephen is the director of the School of Human Ecology at the University of Texas at Austin. He also is the author of the award-winning book, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Schooling. Stephen is a pioneer in this area of research, and I'm honored that he found time in his busy schedule to share his insights with us. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I'm a sociologist by training. I was doing my PhD in sociology and actually postdoc, and I was studying adolescent development and family relationships. I thought I was a family sociologist, but I also came out in my 20s in grad school and got involved, in AIDS activism in the early 1990s, late 80s, early 1990s, and was doing that. I had this life where I was, involved in community action and activism while I was also being a researcher. And as a postdoc, I happened to be across the hall from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. They were fielding the first wave of what was the first large-scale survey of adolescent health since the early 1970s, and this was happening in the mid-90s. We hadn't really asked and it was prompted by the AIDS crisis. What we realized in the early studies was that the early seroconversion studies was it could take 10 years to know that you are HIV positive. A lot of these people that are getting sick must have contracted the virus when they were teenagers, and we know nothing about adolescent sexual health. That was the original motivation. There's another long politicized story about that study that has to do with homophobia and the fear of asking some kinds of questions to adolescents. But my colleagues said to me, there are these questions about, have you ever had a romantic attraction to a male? Have you ever had a romantic attraction to a female? They asked everybody in the study, do you think that there are any boys that would have said yes to the male question and girls that said yes to the girl question? And I said, well, probably. And we published, by this time it was 1999, 2000, we published the first national probability sample studies to document health risk of sexual minority, or what we thought of then as gay and lesbian youth, showing, the things that community studies had pointed. A small handful of community studies had identified suicide risk and substance use risk and depressive symptoms and those kind of the bad news. And we published the first national studies to document that. And at that point, being involved in community advocacy and activism around HIV rights and justice, I was aware that sort of documenting risk is a double-edged sword, that we both needed the evidence, but that the risk of sort of re-stigmatizing people by talking only about the bad news was real. And I started to become then interested in, having not studied specifically, sexuality. Well, there weren't people studying it, but I became interested in tracing the risk and vulnerability. I mean, again, it's hard to believe how much has changed so quickly. But at the time, we were fighting against the homosexuality's mental illness, even though
Yeah.
in 1970, even though it's now been 50 years this year since the, since the dramatic advocacy at the American Psychiatric Association
Hmm.
to declassify homosexuality as mental illness, but we were still pushing against that, and those findings were used against uh, funding and things for queer kids, because the argument was, well, that's, well, of course their problem. This is the origin of the problem is illness. And so I began to try to trace. I'm a sociologist, and I began to try
Hmm.
to trace the vulnerability to the experiences that kids have as they grow up in their families, in their schools, in their communities. Um, and it was, I found myself in California as a faculty member at the beginning of my career at UC Davis, near Sacramento. I had published these studies. It was also the beginning, the very first like school advocacy
Hmm.
was starting to happen. A group called GSA Network, Gay Straight Alliance Network,
Hmm.
was founded in California to connect youth in schools that were starting clubs in their schools to kind of be to speak out against bullying and homophobia, and to create positive school climates for uh, gay and lesbian. Again, that's the, way back then
Hmm.
is kind of the framework we had, youth. And those folks and some other folks in California were doing legislative advocacy, and they contacted me and said, can you're the researcher, and I had published some studies of suicide and substance use. I was like, I don't know anything about schools. I don't know anything about this. And they said, well, help us think about how we can. Kids are coming out in schools and their teachers don't know what to do, and how do we understand that? And so that pulled me into, uh, combined with my own sort of impulse to think about creating social, using research to create positive social change. I got connected with people who started um, works, particularly early in California then, around advocacy for policies and practices that would create safe and supportive schools, and that sort of put me on this trajectory. Is that so? Is that too much? Yeah.
Not too much at all. In fact, there was so much in what you said that takes me back that I want to talk about. Um, because at some point we need to relive this history for everybody who's dealing with this issue now, so that they can understand how far we've come in some areas and where we've regressed in others, which is kind of
Yes.
fascinating that we're still fighting some of these same issues again. Like in the late 80s and early 90s, AIDS pushed discussions of orientation and identity back into, I mean, for lack of a better term, into the closet. It made that we
Yeah.
couldn't discuss these issues that in the 70s we'd started discussing, as you brought out.
Right.
We'd recognized that, especially during adolescence, our feelings, our emotions, our identities are incredibly fluid. Everyone goes through. People who are gay will have straight feelings in their adolescence. People who ultimately recognize that they are straight will have gay feelings during adolescence. That's just part of what adolescence is. Then AIDS comes along, and we're forced to, or we feel compelled, or people feel frightened to discuss these things openly. We're going through this again, I guess is my point, as I'm trying to make,
Yes.
Stephen. We're back at where,
Absolutely.
yeah, where we can't talk about this. And one of the things that I really like about your research is that you focus a lot. I mean, you've done, you've had so many publications, and hopefully we're going to link to many of them so that the listeners can read some of them on their own. But you focus very early on the support that adolescents receive during adolescence and outcomes for them during adolescence, but also later on in their life. And
Yeah.
what I like about that, and I think that you did such a great job of setting it up, is that we had thought about we thought about identity and orientation almost as a risk factor for later for other outcomes, negative outcomes. And you changed the topic a little bit. You changed, no, it's not someone's orientation, somebody's identity that sets them up for potential negative outcomes. It's the support that they're given in their community and in the home.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, uh, it's important to just acknowledge what a extraordinary culture we live in, that it is taboo in the human race, the Homo sapiens, for parents to reject their offspring.
Mm.
It's not something that happens
Hmm.
in most mammals, even. I
Hmm.
mean, there are these exceptions. You can like literally study the exceptions to the times that parents reject their offspring. We have a culture where the time that it's thinkable is when your kid is queer.
Mm.
And that is stunning when you think
Hmm.
about like literally the human species, that it is
Oh,
okay to it is okay, and in fact imperative and
right.
important to reject your kid if they're to like it is such a violation of what it means to be in a family, what it means to be an okay person, that it becomes okay. So we have to like that, to me, is like a big backdrop piece of
Hmm.
like why families struggle, because we live in a culture where it's like not unthinkable, that
Right.
we would reject our children. Like,
And can
what
I
could
just
be more
pause
horrible?
you?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me pause you there for just a moment because I want to emphasize something that you just said. Some families are socialized into believing that it might be okay to reject their offspring, but genetically, they have to fight against their own genetic inclinations in order to even do that. They have to fight against the thing that we were evolved to be. And so
Yeah.
it's not that it's okay. It's an actual war that has to happen within an individual to fight who they are as a human being. So please continue on
Yeah,
that
it's
happy note,
deep.
Stephen.
It's deep. And I,
Yeah.
and I think that this is, I think when I reflect back to sort of the ethos of the early studies of gay and lesbian kids and their parents, I think we often problematize the parents as like the parents are not, the parents are, we got to protect gay kids from their parents because their parents aren't nice to them, their parents don't support them, their
Hmm.
parents aren't kind to them. And I think or, as we paid more attention and listened to parents, what we
Yeah.
learned was how what a conflict and struggle. I mean, it is very unusual for parents to not be struggling
Yeah.
around their kids. And this is actually, if we fast forward to today, and I don't mean to be not linear, but if we fast forward today and we think about the situation for trans and gender diverse youth and what parents care, thoughtful, often painful,
Hmm.
complicated discernment about what's best for their kids. And to think that so many families now are in states or in situations where what they know to be
Hmm.
the right thing for their kid, what their doctors, what their psychiatrists and psychologists, what the people who are the experts tell them is the right thing for their kid, is actually being litigated as, and legislated as wrong and as abuse, and as
Right.
it's really, really deep and traumatic and
Yeah.
serious to think of that. It is not the case that families willy-nilly just decide that they're going to put their kids on hormones and change their kids' sex. That doesn't happen that way.
Right.
Most families find this to be a path that is very complicated. It's deeply challenges our most fundamental thinking about our families, about our kids, about gender, about sex and gender. And for families to arrive at the place where they need to support social transition for their children is a deep moment for them. And
Hmm.
to think that a legislator would know better than they know, than their child knows, than their family doctor knows,
Hmm.
than their faith community knows in many cases, is insulting. Doesn't even begin to sort of cover what that
Hmm.
means for a family, if not, I mean, obviously harmful. Families are like the essential institution that shapes and guides us, but
Hmm.
most kids grow up in places where school is mandatory. Faith community is often part, but not necessarily. That's variable. But school and family are essential, and schools have been places that have that are really have very diverse perspectives nowadays. I mean, there are schools that are have done lots of proactive and important strategies to create positive and safe environments. There are also places that have been characterized by um, hostility, even
Mm-hmm.
by
Mm-hmm.
peers and by the adults in those systems. And then we see now, efforts to literally legislate silence, and to take away the kinds of strategies that we know have made a difference for creating safe and supportive schools. So you have a time when um, there's more visibility than ever. There's more possibility to understand yourself as an LGBTQ, as a future queer person, as a queer person now, queer kid now, and a queer person of the future. But the stakes are really shifting. Families are in different places, and the environments that kids have to go to every day are in really different places, and it puts it it's complicated. And so what we know is what's frustrating is to know that we have now what we didn't have 10 years ago, which is a really clear body of consensus of science that tells us the strategies in schools and families that make a difference for creating safe support and promoting positive development for sexual and gender
Mm-hmm.
minority kids. And those are the things that are being, attacked and dismantled. That's what's frustrating. I mean, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine has issued reports 2019 and 2020 that explicitly name for the first time sort of the scientific consensus on what creates a safe and supportive school for sexual and gender minority kids, how families can be supportive, and those are the strategies. Those are the things that are now under attack, and that's what's concerning to me
Mm-hmm.
as a researcher.
What are some of the things that happen when we don't support our kids?
Everything we want to prevent in
Yeah.
the lives of kids are the things that we see are the consequence of stigma, discrimination, and mistreatment in childhood and adolescence. There's a classic framework called ACEs, the Adverse Childhood
Mm-hmm.
Experiences, and there's some scholars that are friends of mine that are extending ACEs to understand sexual and gender minority ACEs, the kinds of
Mm-hmm.
experiences that we have in childhood that set us up for literal, both the social experiences that we have, our mental health, but also literally our physiological health is patterned based on the kinds of negative responses and negative reactions that we get that are both real, even like physical, but like being experiencing victimization, physical victimization,
Mm-hmm.
but the perception of it, the understanding of yourself is different, the internalization of that, and what that literally does to our physical health. So um, yeah, I haven't named the litany of the problems because it's overwhelming. I mean, if you think
Right.
about like every single kind of health status, and I've worked with colleagues on, writing about the cancer, like the
Yeah.
precursors to cancer, are
Right.
all set this are developed during adolescence. I mean, all of the sort of behavioral and physiological things that manifest as cancer in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s are things that are set, begin to be put into place during adolescence. And those things, many of those things, are connected around discrimination. I mean, and these are things that, I mean, I think one of the things that the study of sexual and gender minority youth is helping broadly the field, and vice versa, is like the intersection with race and ethnicity
Mm-hmm.
and gender, and the ways that we're now understanding so much more deeply how racism, as well as
Mm-hmm.
homophobia and transphobia, literally get under our skin, shape the way that we not only think about ourselves, but literally the ways our bodies react to stress, the ways that our
Mm-hmm.
uh, physiological well-being uh, develops across time.
I've had teachers come up to me with fair amount of regularity, asking if they can even address a child's identity and orientation. They're afraid. They want to support their students. My parents want to support their children. So, what are some strategies that work to show our kids that they are supported as they are
Yeah.
coming to realize their orientation and identity?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't normally start with this, but since the framing is so important about the moment we're in, and
Mm-hmm.
the first thing I would say is resist the chilling effects of these politicized moments that we're in,
Mm.
because I hear it myself. I hear it among university academics. Like, are we allowed to say anything? Oh my gosh, no one has legislated what we can say.
Mm.
Well, don't say gay. That is a complicated thing, right? So like figuring out like absolutely not. I think what happens is that we overinterpret, and that's exactly what the point is.
Mm.
The legislation, for example, in Florida, is written to be so vague that it's not interpretable, except like I can't say anything, I can't do anything, we can't talk about this, which is exactly the point. We've got to
Mm.
figure out a way to like continue to have the strategies to support kids, and those things, and this is the big dilemma. I mean, the things that make a difference, well, non-discrimination and anti-bullying policies and practices are kind of like a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
They're not they're not sufficient. I mean, they're a foundation, but like there are plenty of places that haven't had those laws in place, that plenty of districts and schools and communities that have created the next level strategies,
Right.
um, for creating safe and supportive environments, meaning naming people where they are, having books in libraries and pictures on walls. I mean, this is one of the things about the book banning, that's so uh, unreal.
Mm-hmm.
And as U.S. Americans, we should be so shocked, given our own histories with this, that we would even entertain this at all, because we haven't done this. People ask me, like, what's the research say about that? Well, what the research tells us is that representation is critical for kids, you know, basic desire to be there,
Right.
and their engagement, and then ultimately their academic and personal well-being. We know this. We've known this since the 1970s with Black History Month. We've
Yeah.
known that seeing yourself represented in the formal text of the school, seeing a book in the library, poster on the wall. So what we don't know, we literally don't know, because we haven't studied it. I'm sure there are people now that are going to be studying it, but we have not had moments like we haven't had it. This is unique since when did we have book bannings in the United States? I mean, it's unique to think that we're
Yeah.
taking books out of libraries. And so we haven't studied that specific. We certainly know that the introduction of the books in the libraries makes a positive difference for kids in their belonging
Mm-hmm.
and in their well-being. And the important other thing to note about this set of findings is that it's not just the minoritized kids for whom there's a benefit.
Right.
The introduction of these kinds of safe schools uh, practices and strategies,
Right.
um, is evident for the whole school community. I mean,
Yep.
what we see with population data, for example, state of California data, where we have millions of students surveys, and we can look at what the policies and practices in the schools are. When schools have teacher trainings
Mm-hmm.
for understanding sexual orientation and gender identity, when schools have school clubs that support LGBTQ kids, compared to the schools that don't have those things,
Yeah.
the average levels of safety are higher.
You mentioned the naming them where they are, and this gets a lot of press now. What's powerful about addressing kids by a name that they have chosen for where they are?
I mean, at some level, it's such an absurd
Mm.
question, isn't it? I mean, it's so
Mm-hmm.
like, it's about like recognizing and seeing a person for who they want to be. The reality is that we all have, we all have uh, a need to understand ourselves and express our identities. That's
Mm-hmm.
the whole point of growing up. That's the whole point of, late childhood and adolescence, is figuring out who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And it absolutely goes without saying that adolescence is a time um, of that self-recognition, and of peer regulation, peer self-consciousness, consciousness of what other people are
Mm-hmm.
thinking, and which introduces this idea of peer and social regulation. And of course, socialization into adult communities, opinionated adults who want you to, look, think, and act certain ways, others who may have, other opinions about that. And so this is the whole stuff of adolescence, is figuring out who we are. And so, for part of it is that young people are pushing up against the master narratives of who they are,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just part of that is literally part of adolescent identity process. Being able to uh, being able to literally name yourself
Mm-hmm.
is tricky, and it's deeply personal,
Mm-hmm.
and it bumps up against many of the kind of norms and beliefs that have been given to us by the people that love us the most, our families, our schools. So challenging that is, it is hard for the people around them,
Mm-hmm.
and the people that chose the name that you were given, for example. But on the other hand, we do it all the time. I mean, there are so many other situations and settings where nicknames are just not a big deal. People,
Mm.
kids pick a dip, kids in sixth grade deciding they're going to start going by their middle name instead of their first name. Or, we have these things that we can trace to the same kinds of developmental and identity processes that are considered completely typical. I think, I think about the university setting that I'm in, the numbers of kids from non-Western US language backgrounds who choose a name that is more legible to
Mm.
Anglo people, because for all kinds of reasons, because it's easier, because they fit in more, because it's easier to go by Susan than it is to go by the
Mm-hmm.
my Chinese name, given name that is difficult to pronounce because the vowels aren't in the Western language. So we
Yeah.
do that. This happens quite a lot in our culture, and yet we've made a big deal about it when it confronts gender.
So, to me, it seems like, although it's quite loaded, you're right that using that chosen name is a wonderful step that any individual can start right away to support the kids, maybe in their own home, but
Right.
definitely the kids in their life. Anything else that you recommend for those parents, those teachers that are just having trouble, like with that first step to supporting the kids in their
Yeah.
life?
Yeah. Well, um, there's a big piece of this that is taking a deep breath and backing up and not seeing everything as a turning point that's going to be
Mm.
forever unchangeable. Part of what I wish we all had a deeper cultural understanding and uh, affection for is just the variability, changeability,
Mm.
exploration that is adolescence
Mm-hmm.
and late childhood and adolescence. It's about figuring it out, and I think so much of the time, parents totally understandably, teachers, they think, oh, now this, now what? And if we just sort of take a deep breath and say, okay, what does that mean for you right now? Let's talk about how it feels and what it means, rather than assuming it's some new unchangeable path that a kid is on. So I think there's one thing which is like we can all take a deep breath and understand the possibilities rather than thinking of this as
Mm.
like a new reality. And for some young people, it might be a new reality. So how do we take a deep breath and take that in? Um, and then there are the micro things about how do we some parents, for some parents it's very hard to affirm, but can we be neutral
Mm.
rather than rejecting? So like uh, expression through how we look and dress and what we wear, expression through the kinds of what parents do that can be undermining is regulating how we look, what we how we dress, who we hang out with. um, those are the kinds of things that can be really undermining for
Mm-hmm.
kids. I mean, that kids that we think of as just the everyday stuff of parenting, but the teenager thinks of as the thing that is really deeply undermining who I am.
Mm.
And so understanding and thinking about like what are the for parents, thinking about what are the deal breakers, and can I back off a little bit? Can I uh, introduce some flexibility in the way I think about my kid, the way I think about how they engage in the world, and also just sit back and be patient and imagine that this is an expression that may be here next week too, and it may be here next
Mm-hmm.
month, and it may shift in a different way, and that's not shouldn't we shouldn't think of that as scary. We should think of that as completely typical and part of what young people are teaching us. I mean, I think the thing that's different for people that are, I don't know what our age is, my age, old enough to have kids in their 20s or something, or
Right.
30s, is that we didn't have the possibility as late in late childhood and adolescence to explore our genders and sexualities. We just didn't. It wasn't something
Mm-hmm.
that was part of what was an option to us in
Mm-hmm.
culture. And what newer generations, younger generations have shown us
Mm-hmm.
is that we can think about and explore and understand. I mean, you pointed out earlier, you made the comment that that straight kids think about and wonder
Mm-hmm.
about their sexuality, just like
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ kids. That sexual identity development is something that everybody goes through. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
figures out their sexuality, and what young people have done is put that front and center and made that part of their identity exploration in
Mm-hmm.
ways that are historically new. And now gender has been brought into that. So the idea that we can be, so many kids can say, I don't want to be binary gender. I'm not like exactly a guy kind of guy.
Right.
And I want to, it doesn't mean that I want to be a woman necessarily, but it means that I don't want to be only a dude. And so what does that look like? And how can we just like sit back and try to understand that and explore that?
Stephen, I
I'm
want to
talking
thank you
too
so
much.
much for your no, not at all. And I'm going to encourage my listeners to look up all of your different publications because they're all valuable in helping us like create a better path for all of our kids. But I do want to thank you for what you have dedicated your professional career to, which was helping kids through adolescence to have a better relationship with their families and to ultimately have happier, more successful lives. So, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
That was Stephen Russell. For more information about Stephen, including links to several of his articles, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. And if I'm sounding a little bit more Lauren Bacall than normal, it's because I'm recording under a giant Canadian smoke cloud. But remember, kids are young goats and young children. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.